and chair in international relations at the European University Institute, and a professor in international relations at the University of Oxford, where she previously studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Earlier in her career, she served as Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect. Welcome, Professor Welsh.
Great to be here.
And we have with us Tari Ajadi, an assistant professor, also in McGill's Department of Political Science, where his research explores how Black activists in mid-sized cities strategize to prompt change in policing and in health policy. In addition to Black politics, he specializes in Canadian politics, public policy, and social movements. Thank you, Professor Ajadi, and welcome to our webcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, just a note that if you're watching us live and you have questions for our panel, you can email us at aoc@mcgill.ca, and I'll do my best to address them to our guests. So let's get started. Maybe I'll start with the first basic question that I alluded to in my introduction, which is this. Is next week's federal election, in fact, as high stakes and consequential as many media pundits have made it out to be? And what is truly at stake when Canadians choose their next government? Professor Welsh, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. It's great to be having this discussion. I think it is one of the more consequential elections we've had in the last several decades, in part because of the dramatic developments we're seeing in the United States and the changes in the Canada-US relationship, which have been really significant, but also really rapid in terms of how things are moving forward. And so for Canadians, the question is, who do they want to lead us through what is going to be a very uncertain time for the Canada-US relationship, but also for the world at large? And it's consequential, partly because we will have a new prime minister from what we've had for a number of years, although Mark Carney has been the prime minister for a short period of time. But also there's the question of whether they will have a majority or not. And, you could argue that at a time of flux and challenge like we have, having a majority government would give those who are in power in Ottawa greater leeway to make some dramatic policy announcements and changes. So I think it is very consequential. It is, we're seeing this in terms of the number of people who came out in advance voting, which was really extraordinary over the holiday weekend. And the mood in the country suggests that Canadian voters are taking their role seriously in terms of charting the course forward for the next 4 to 5 years.
Professor Ajadi, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. And sort of what are your initial reactions as a political scientist, to the developments of really not just the campaign, but even going back to the end of last year, when Justin Trudeau was still prime minister and really at that point had shown no indications of stepping down. I mean, it seems we've gone through quite a lot of developments in a very short period.
Yeah, it's been a heck of a time to study Canadian politics. For decades, it was like, okay, we have gentle shifts, right? Like we develop piecemeal, and then a lot happened in a very short amount of time. So certainly, I do think that this is a very high stakes election. Of course, as Professor Welsh described, this trade war, these massive global shifts matter. They matter a lot, right? The rise of populism globally. The kind of distinct realignments that we're seeing, that's really consequential. But if this election would have been high stakes even without those broader developments, right? We've had 10 years or approximately 10 years of the Liberals in government. Typically speaking, Canadian politics, you tend to get changed elections after 8 to 12 years, right? So this would have been the time where that record really would have been under scrutiny anyway. We also have all of these really consequential programs that have been developed over the past few years that essentially are in the balance right now when we're thinking about $10 a day childcare, pharmacare, dental care. We've got this recently announced high-speed rail project, even the independent Senate, and of course, broader considerations around the climate and climate policy. And all of these things are being contested in this election. So we've got that broader global context, but we also have a national context that is very much prime for a kind of meaningful and robust discussion about, well, what are we doing here, right? Like, what direction are we going in? What really matters?
Very interesting. So let me just go back to you, Professor Welsh. You brought up an interesting point, Professor Ajadi, about this being a sort of traditional change election after 10 years of one party being in power. And if I think back to the fall, the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre were riding sky high in the polls, and everybody assumed this was going to be a majority government for the Conservatives, maybe even a landslide victory. And then, of course, I guess the big development is that Prime Minister Trudeau announced he was going to resign. Did that essentially save the Liberal Party's electoral chances, or is there more at play here?
Well, I think it did in part. Although, for many, when they were looking at the level of support for the Liberal Party in the summer, it looked as though it was going to be a dire election had it been had in the fall. I think it wasn't just Trudeau's resignation that made the difference. It was also the election in the United States. So yes, I think the Liberals would have had some bump regardless, and an opportunity for a new leader to try to set a new course. But I think it's the election of Donald Trump and then the specific actions taken vis-a-vis Canada that created this context of, our country is under attack. We need to come together. We need to have a vision for who we are. We need to assert our sovereignty. We need to think about building a national economy. And so that raised the issue of who do we see as the serious leader for, people have used the word kind of wartime moment. It's not a war. It's certainly an economic competition, an economic war of sorts. But who do we trust? Who do we believe can be a steadfast leader in this context? And really, you talk to political scientists, they will tell you that we have never seen in recent memory, the last 40 to 50 years, poll shifts like we have seen in Canada, a 25% shift in numbers for the Conservatives towards the Liberals. So the realignment has been really astonishing that you can have this incumbent government. And let's remember that around the world, when you look at recent elections in advanced democracies, incumbents have taken a huge beating. We can just look at Joe Biden, but you can look elsewhere. You can look at the Conservatives in the UK. You can look at even in Germany. So there have been lots of signs that show that incumbents, partly because of cost of living issues, have been kicked out. And yet here we are with a dramatic change in poll numbers. If we look at just the percentages today, on the day we're recording this, the Liberals are at 40%, the Conservatives at 37%. If you actually factor in those who have a strong intention to vote, it's even slightly higher. It's 42%. So essentially, the combination of Justin Trudeau's resignation, but much more so, the election of Donald Trump and what that has done to our domestic politics have completely upended what we might have expected to happen in this election.
So, Professor Ajadi, maybe we could walk through what's happened since the election of Donald Trump. So it seems to me that when he was elected in the fall, he was, perhaps the Americans perhaps sent a message or a wink to the world that it's okay to elect a populist, to elect someone on the right wing, someone with conservative views, maybe even what you'd call an illiberal approach to democracy. And that may have served as a buoy or a boost to conservative movements around the world, including someone like Pierre Poilievre, who in many ways styled himself as some would say a mini Donald Trump. And yet then Donald Trump comes to power in January. And, some would say it's been sort of very chaotic south of the border and tumultuous, very brazen in his rule. Does that mean that the pendulum has sort of shifted back now to the center? Maybe you can just help us unpack how that has sort of played out in the States and what that's meant for the polls and for the election here in Canada.
Absolutely. So I think that one of the things that's really notable here is the ways that, in looking at how things have unfolded in the United States, in looking at the shift to what, political scientists would kind of identify as competitive authoritarianism in the United States, right? Like there's a kind of distinct movement towards, away from democratic practices and principles in the United States. You get a real kind of through the looking glass moment about some of these kinds of proposals. Now, I would push back against the idea that Pierre Poilievre is like Donald Trump. I mean, he's been a committed partisan his entire life, since he was a high schooler, right? Like, he is the modern Conservative Party. He served in Stephen Harper's cabinet, right? Like, he's a party lifer. And in that, even with his populist stylings, you go look at the Conservative Party platform. And of course, there are some things that kind of give a wink and a nudge to this kind of broader populist move. But on the other hand, you're talking about GST cuts, right? Like the liberals are talking about. You know what I mean? Like it's not quite the same things as this kind of radical, at least economically, tariff agenda or deporting citizens or things like that. Those don't exist in the same register, in the same kind of milieu. So there's that kind of thing where Poilievre's styling, his rhetorical styling, does kind of map onto a mirror from some of what we see from Donald Trump, but it's not quite the same thing. But I actually think that the crucial evolution here is an understanding that in Canada, the Liberal Party is the party of nationalism, not the Conservatives, right? The Liberal Party is the party. When we think about some of the planks of Canadian identity, people resonate with the Liberal Party. People talk about, for example, universal healthcare or Medicare. That's a Liberal Party kind of plank and platform. The Liberal Party tends to defend that. When we think about multiculturalism, again, that is something that people think about when we think about the Liberal Party. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I mean, we can look at Liberal Party branding and look at the flag, and we can see kind of mirroring there. So it's not surprising to me in some ways that in a moment where people are retrenching back to a kind of nationalistic identity to say we need to protect our sovereignty, that actually moving to the Liberal Party is the choice that they're making. One other piece here is that I think that Poilievre was the perfect foil for Justin Trudeau. They were both kind of rhetorically very flamboyant, but they had kind of different audiences that they were catering towards, right? Different constituencies that they liked to bring out. Mark Carney is not a great kind of foil for Pierre Poilievre. He doesn't have the same kind of credentials. He doesn't have the same kind of disposition as Justin Trudeau did. And so the fight is a lot harder for Poilievre, and he's not been able to pivot, I think, in the way that he might have liked.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, Professor Welsh? Is that an accurate assessment? And I just want to maybe come back on something else you talked about, sort of, the pushback against incumbents. I mean, the Liberal Party, even though Mark Carney is the leader, they are still the incumbent. So I guess my question is, how has Mark Carney directly benefited from all of these developments, happening south of the border and the surge in patriotism? How has that benefited him in his race against Pierre Poilievre?
Oh, I think it's benefited him enormously. If we were to run the counterfactual, where would we be without Trump's election? And I think it's not clear. I mean, yes, the Liberals have a lead in the polls under Mark Carney. It's a 3% lead, but how that cashes out, I think is the big question, because of course the Liberal vote is much more efficient than the Conservative vote in terms of how this will translate into seats. But without Donald Trump as your, I don't want to say your foe, but your counterpart in the United States, I think the election would have looked very different. And Professor Ajadi is absolutely right that Mark Carney is not the candidate that Pierre Poilievre would have wanted to run against in this election. He had been preparing for a long time to run against Justin Trudeau, and had a very good chance of beating him. And even if you had a different Liberal candidate emerge from Justin Trudeau's cabinet, I think it would have been difficult for the Liberals to win the election, because there would have been so much association with 9 years of Liberal government. So what Mark Carney has been able to do is to come into the race and say, yes, I'm a Liberal, I have all of that association with the Liberal Party, with the great policies of the Liberal Party over decades, to which I would add, it was a Liberal Prime Minister who gave us our flag, Lester Pearson, right?
Right.
But I'm a very different animal, right? I was not a member of the Trudeau government. And by the way, I'm not a career politician. I am someone who comes into this race with a background of experience, with skills, with the kind of resume you would want in a crisis. And lo and behold, we're in a crisis. And so I am the perfect person for this moment. And I think that's been able to be the mantra for him. And in a way, he's very lucky that the election is short, because as long as that is the focus of Canadians as they look at the tableau of leaders, he has a real advantage. If we had had an election that went on for 3 months, Canadians would have got to know him even better as being more than just someone who is good in a crisis. I'm sure more good things would have come out, but maybe also some more controversial things. But because our elections are so short, he has run on that main note, and that has been incredibly powerful.
Well, you say he's lucky, but I suppose that's also by design, right? I mean, he chose to
Yeah,
call the
he
election
chose this
so
moment.
quickly and such a short campaign. So,
Yeah.
so it almost feels like the Mark Carney's mantra is "I'm not Justin Trudeau," and Pierre Poilievre's mantra is "I'm not Donald Trump." So let me turn back to you, Professor Ajadi. You talked a bit about Pierre Poilievre. I mean, and we're only 5 days away from the campaign, from the election, so there's not that much time left. But what does Pierre Poilievre, if Pierre Poilievre wants to win this election, what does he need Canadians to think about between now and Monday when they go and cast their ballot to try to win this race?
Well, I mean, one really interesting point that's been made recently, because the Conservatives have come out with a massive ad buy. I mean, they have a lot more money in their coffers compared to any of the other parties, and they came out with this massive ad buy that did not feature Pierre Poilievre at all. What they wanted to do instead was to remind voters that they did not like the Liberals. They did not like the past 10 years, right? So they say we cannot afford 10 more years of the Liberal Party. They aimed their ads primarily at the Masters. So this is, of course, golf. And this was aiming, yeah, I'm sure there are some viewers here that might be young and a massive golf enthusiast, but the general trend is that this is an older audience. Why? Well, it seems that Mark Carney is winning the kind of quote unquote boomer set, right? And that's not being the typical Liberal constituency. Instead, the Liberals have typically aimed at millennials, people 45 and under, right? So Mark Carney has very much been able to pivot into a space. Pierre Poilievre is trying to pivot back there. What does that really mean? Well, it means that people know that Pierre Poilievre is unpopular. Pierre Poilievre as a figure in and of himself, I think, has turned off some voters throughout the campaign. He's made several significant flubs, whether it relates to women's rights, talking about people's biological clocks, whether it's relating to kind of focusing on things that people otherwise would not like to talk about, like plastic straws. There's been infighting in the Conservative campaign between the kind of more progressive wing, as typified by Doug Ford, Corey Tenayk, and some of those people, and the more kind of populist wing. So that's Jenny Byrne, who's Pierre Poilievre's campaign manager. So these things are ongoing. And what I think the Conservatives need to do and are trying to do is to take Pierre Poilievre, the figure, out of it and focus the lens and the attention on the fact that people did dislike the Liberals for a very long period of time. People were unsatisfied, and they're trying to remind people of that fact and say, do you really want 4 more years of this? Will that argument work? Potentially. We're seeing the polls tighten after the debates, right? We've seen that all of the platforms are finally out, and a note here to say that, I don't think it's right that people have voted in the advanced polls, 7.3 million people, and one party has simply decided not to release their platform until after advanced polling closed. That's a real challenge. But not, I think that what they're trying to do is to say, we know you were dissatisfied with the Liberals. Don't let this crisis make you forget that you wanted change. We can provide the change, but not really putting Pierre Poilievre in the front of that.
Derek, just a quick note to add. to what Tari has said, I think it is interesting that the demographic breakdowns of some of these polls, at least one that I saw from Abacus polling 2 weeks ago, showed that it was older voters, those over 45, who were most concerned about the Canada-US relationship and Donald Trump. Younger voters, their top issues are cost of living, or the cost of housing, inflation. And that, of course, is another theme that Pierre Poilievre has wanted to hammer home in this election. But it's quite interesting to see the difference in where different age groups are putting their emphasis. Now, as we move in towards Monday, that may be shifting again, but he's absolutely right that there's a segment of kind of over 45s who are focused on the US, what the US is represents as a threat to Canadian economic interests in particular. Younger voters still really concerned by those issues that the Conservatives have wanted to highlight.
So just to follow up on that, Professor Welsh, do you think at the end of the day, this election will ultimately come down to the single issue of who can best manage the relationship with Donald Trump? And if that is the big issue in voters' minds, who has the edge?
So I would have said yes 2 weeks ago. I would have said absolutely 2 weeks ago. And I would have said the edge would go to Mark Carney, given the way he positioned himself, given his CV, given the sense that some had that Pierre Poilievre was more a partisan politician who's great for theatrics in the House of Commons, who knows how to have a great debate. Is he really a serious figure for serious times? Now, as we get closer and the election is, it's still a week away, I have detected that I think there are some voters who are broadening the set of things they want to focus on when they cast their ballot. But because it's less than a week away, I think the Liberals may still be carried by that. But I do think it's changed in the last 10 to 14 days a little bit.
Okay, Professor Ajadi, what are your thoughts on that? And if we put aside the Donald Trump issue, is there really a lot of daylight between the two parties? I know they've come out with different platforms, and I mean, is there a lot for voters to choose from amongst the conservative and liberal platforms, or is it really the relationship with the United States right now?
I think there's some variance between the Conservatives and the Liberals. I think there's considerably less variance than there would have been 6 months ago. So I do think that Mark Carney has changed the kind of pivot and trajectory of the party far more towards a kind of center-right orientation. Both parties are planning to do a lot of spending, and if you kind of wave away some of the what Mark Carney called magical thinking in the Conservative platform, both parties are planning to run significant deficits for the next few years. I don't think that there's that much difference. We think about some of their top line items, this GST cuts, for first time home buyers, some of these kind of affordability principles. Again, we're talking very similar things, and it's really about the kind of tools that they'll use to get partners, whether at the provincial or municipal level, to agree to work with them. So Mark Carney will simply buy out development charges at the municipal level. Pierre Poilievre will demand that those development charges get waived away, otherwise X, Y, or Z negative consequences. But we're talking about the same kind of conceptualization of the problem, broadly speaking. So there's not that much daylight between the two parties. And I think that that's intentional on the Liberal Party side, because what they're saying is they don't necessarily have the edge on cost of living either, right? That we still have something to say in that kind of domain. And so I think that was why they tried to position themselves in that space. I would agree with Jennifer. I think that, to be honest, the polls have tightened quite significantly. And I think that that's partially also because we've not heard that much from the United States about Canada in the past couple of weeks. And really where the Liberals have gotten a kind of shoring up of support, perhaps, is by the collapse of the NDP and to a lesser extent the Bloc, right? Like that's what really pushed them into majority territory, particularly in places like the GTA, British Columbia, and Quebec. Now, if people decide to say, well, you know what, we can afford to vote for the NDP, we can afford to vote for the Bloc, the threat isn't as dire as we first thought, all of a sudden we'll start to see a shift, because the Conservative Party support has been relatively stable, right? When we're talking about 38%. The Conservatives, high floor, low ceiling, right? They always stick somewhere in this kind of solid base. And so, it will tighten a little bit, I think. But in the end, I do suspect that the Liberals will win.
Okay, great. So just a reminder, if you're watching us live and you have a question for our panel, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. I do want to come back to the NDP and the Bloc Québécois in a minute, but let me just turn back to you, Professor Welsh. Is it unusual that international events like trade wars and relationships with a foreign country would play such a central role in a federal election? Like, do we have any precedent for this when we're so used to elections being decided by domestic issues?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, most Canadian elections are not fought on issues that are beyond our borders. And I would say that's often true for many democracies. But we have had elections in the past. I mean, one in my living memory is the 1988 free trade election, which was very much focused, of course, on the US. That was a big election. You were, Canadians divided over that question. It was the ballot box question. You had advocates, erasing the border between Canada and the US. It was, it was high stakes. And I think when this campaign began, that's what it felt like. It felt like Canadians, yes, were focused on some domestic issues, but this was a consequential election because of our relationship with the United States that was fundamentally changing. And so when they were looking at the parties, they were looking at who can help Canada survive and thrive and assert Canadian sovereignty. And so I do think it's very unusual in that respect that for many voters, that will be the deciding factor, an issue that goes beyond our borders, but which of course affects our security and our prosperity. So I think in that sense, that's an added factor to the importance of this election.
Oh, interesting. Professor Ajadi, I'm curious. You mentioned Donald Trump talking a lot about Canada, I think before the election was called, certainly before Carney became prime minister. And he sort of, like he's wont to do, moved his focus to something else. I guess it's Harvard University this week. So my question is, do you think Donald Trump is paying much attention to the Canadian election? And does he have a preferred candidate? Or perhaps the most important question is, should that matter to Canadian voters?
I'll answer your last part of the question first. No, it shouldn't matter to Canadian voters because, again, if we have sovereignty, we have to act like it. And if we have sovereignty, we can't try to kind of galaxy brain our way to figuring out what exactly it is that Donald Trump wants. Which, I mean, I won't call the person names on the webcast, but one might assume that I don't think highly of his kind of strategic or political kind of inclinations here. I do think that he has a strategy here, right? We heard, for example, Premier Danielle Smith talking on the Breitbart podcast, essentially asking him to maybe step back a little bit so that Pierre Poilievre could win. And at one point, he mentioned that he thinks it would be easier to work with the Liberals than it would be with the Conservatives, which I personally don't believe at all, and I think is a strategic move. I think that to some extent, Donald Trump does still have these kind of desires or machinations for something from Canada. My bet is on resources, but no one can really be too sure. But I do think that he believes, and I think that the kind of records would indicate that the Conservative Party of Canada might be more amenable to some of the things that Donald Trump wants than the Liberal Party would. So from the perspective of Donald Trump, I would suspect that they might be hoping for a CPC win. Now, do I think that means becoming the 51st state? Of course not. Of course not. But I do think that as potentially there might be a new renegotiation of the USMCA deal, people are asking about things like supply management. People are asking for things like French language protections, right? These are identified as the United States. The United States identified these as trade barriers or frictions, right? And so these are things that they want to be dispensed with. There are wings in the Conservative Party that very much would like to get rid of supply management and would like to maybe get rid of some French language protection on kind of trade goods. And so we've heard these things come up in leadership campaigns in the past. There's particular wings of the party. So I do think that there's a possibility that Trump would prefer the CPC. Now, is he paying that much attention? I'm not really sure what he focuses on
Yeah.
on a daily basis.
I do think, though, Derek, Canadians' perceptions are interesting on this. So we have at the Max Bell School here at McGill, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is actually observing and monitoring all the online content during the Canadian election. And about 3 weeks before the election was called, they had a survey of Canadians' expectations around foreign interference in the election. Remember that the country just went through a really big and consequential foreign interference inquiry.
Right.
And in mid-March, Canadians believed that what country was the most likely to interfere in the Canadian election, ahead of Russia, ahead of China, ahead of India? It was the United States, remarkably. Canadians expected there to be. Now, whether there in fact has been is another question, but I think Canadians' perceptions were that there might be a preference in the United States, that there might be a lot of action on X in favor of some candidates rather than others. So I think that's interesting just to reflect on.
Very interesting. I do want to salute you, Professor Ajadi, for using the term galaxy brain, which I had never heard about in my life until it appeared in the New York Times crossword last week. So there you go, twice in 1 week now. So let me go back to you, Professor Ajadi. You mentioned the NDP earlier, and we spent most of this conversation talking about Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. I'm wondering what has become of the NDP and why have their fortunes slid so much, at least if the polls are to be believed? And I'll get your perspective, Professor Welsh, on that as well, if you don't mind.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, this, I think, is, for me, one of the most notable things that's gone on in this campaign, right? The NDP, who had entered into a confidence and supply agreement with the Liberals, this has been the longest lasting minority government in Canadian federal history, right? Or the longest confidence and supply agreement. They've been decimated. I do think that a big part of this is, of course, again, this question of who can form government in the midst of American intervention in Canada, whatever intervention might mean, right? And so I do think that voters are thinking, hey, these people aren't ever going to form government, and therefore we have to park our vote with one of the two other parties that we know might form government, and that might be having an impact. But I don't think that that tells the whole story. I think that there's something more significant going on. I think there's been a erosion in the kind of central organization of the party. I think that there's infighting in their base. I think that there's a confluence of factors that have left the NDP looking at whether or not they'll even make official party status. I don't think that that was a given fact just because of the intervention by President Trump. Instead, I think that actually the NDP was heading for an electoral defeat that was quite significant anyway. And what you have now is a series of almost disconnected incumbents who are looking to protect their specific seats rather than a party that has national ambitions and has a kind of muscular vision. And of course, the NDP is one of the things that makes Canada's parliament and Canada's democracy unique, right? And so I think that this is a significant shift, and it's one that we need to track over a little bit of time. Every election can have anomalies, and you might say, well, if the NDP doesn't get official party status now, a decade ago, there was the Orange Wave. They had 110 seats or 111 seats, right? Things can ebb and flow. But I do think that their internal party infrastructure might need a complete overhaul, right? In order to get them in a place where they could project a vision again.
Professor Welsh?
Yeah, I think there's two big things going on here in addition to what Tari has mentioned. I think number one, Canadians are very focused on the economy. They are, tariffs are going to have and are already having a devastating effect. There is a recognition that Canada is going to have to reimagine and rebuild a national economy. And they are looking at the NDP and asking themselves, are they a credible actor to revitalize our economy? And so I think that is at the top of a lot of people's minds. I was listening to interviews with people from who had done advanced voting, and so many of them, especially women, when they were asked what really swayed your vote, they said the economy, which I think is really interesting because it's the economy, but in a North American global context. We're in a new economic situation. And so there was a competence issue there for some voters around the NDP. And I think the second and related is if it's a serious election, and it's really consequential, and this is about who can take our country forward in much more turbulent times, we don't have the luxury to vote for parties that may not form government, and we don't have the luxury to vote for leaders who we're not certain can be credible in that context. And remember, Jagmeet Singh is the leader that Canadians know the best in coming into this election. And I think in some ways he suffers from that. He's fought in other elections. You know, the comment he made just before the election was called that, you know, he would not invite Donald Trump to the G7 meeting in Canada in June. I think that may have hurt him, whether you agree with it or not. Some of you may agree with it. I think that created this doubt, you know, is this the person who we think can function in the kind of environment that a Canadian Prime Minister is going to need to function in over the coming months and at least 2 years.
And he's been the leader of the NDP since 2017, which means he's now gone through 2 elections that he's lost, or the party did not perform as well as maybe they had hoped. Was it sort of a mistake to keep him as leader for this election? It seems like, you know, usually you get maybe 2 shots at an election. I don't know, Professor Ajadi, did they stick with him for too long?
Perhaps. I mean, I think that the NDP has been searching since Jack Layton died, and the kind of brief Mulcair tenure to define exactly what it is. I think that their base, like other parties, is having a difficult time bridging to find exactly what its messaging is, right? You have folks on the very far left in the party that want to kind of establish social democracy as a kind of meaningful term, that like very much have distinct stances that might be to the left of where many Canadians might be. You have others in the party that think that the party needs to move to the center. And I think that somewhere in the kind of amalgam of these kind of approaches, Jagmeet Singh falls somewhere in the middle, but I don't know that he's inspiring anybody. I really do think that they're in the wilderness in a lot of ways. A lot of their traditional kind of bases are rapidly shrinking and going to other parties. So I suspect that they'll likely have a rethink at leader after this election.
You said, you know, their base might be going to other parties, assuming they and perhaps Green Party voters are feeling the same way. If I think about the political spectrum, I presume that would mean that's going to help the Liberals, right? They would sort of slide to the center to the Liberals and not necessarily hopscotch over to the Conservatives, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what's happening for sure.
Yeah. Professor Welsh, yeah, I
Yeah,
sense you agree.
I think the collapse of the NDP vote will benefit the Liberals. I would also say, I mean, the NDP has an incredibly deep bench in different provinces across Canada. I think after this election, we'll be talking about what the future NDP will look like, and the talent that exists in different provincial settings may come forward. I think it could be a very interesting time for the reimagining of the NDP. But in this particular context of crisis, of focus on the economy, you know, remember that there was, in a sense, you might argue, some of your, you know, our listeners today might argue that the NDP is in a way a victim of some of its success, right? In holding the Liberals' feet to the fire on some of these big social programs, that Canadians do not feel, many of them do not feel, that this election is about saving those, even though that might be the case in some instances. But we have those gains, and now they're slightly more focused on the economy. That's my guess with some of what's going on.
Interesting. So let me stick with you, Professor Welsh. I do want to talk briefly about, since we're talking about third parties, maybe we could talk about fourth parties now, the Bloc Québécois. So at dissolution, I believe they held 33 seats in Quebec, which I believe is something around over 40% of the province's seats in parliament. How has the Bloc Québécois been impacted by this new focus on the relationship with the United States, both in terms of this electoral campaign and perhaps the longer term future of the party and its goals? Would it be fair to say that Quebec voters right now just don't have an appetite to talk about issues like the protection of the French language or let alone setting the stage for a third referendum on secession?
I think it is a fascinating time. If you look at the polls right now in Quebec, you have 33% Liberal vote, you have 30% for the Bloc Québécois, and you have 26% for the Conservatives, and then 9% for the NDP. So that too, we've seen a huge amount of flux. I don't think I'd go so far as to say there still isn't the concern about the French language. I think there still is. I think what's interesting, and I heard one Quebec commentator put it this way, that Quebec voters, for the first time in a long time, really care about who is going to be the government in Ottawa. Well, what is that government going to look like? Whereas, those who supported the Bloc in particular, their vote was about sending. Ottawa was a place where you sent politicians to stand up for Quebec's rights. And now the question is, no, we really care who that government is going to be in Ottawa, not just us sending our voice to Ottawa. And when they make that calculation, I think Quebecers are more comfortable with a Liberal government, given their own political culture in this province, particularly around questions such as energy and climate change and social programs. There has been an extension in this wave of patriotism that we're seeing in Canada to the province of Quebec as well. And I wouldn't say that there's less commitment to Quebec's distinctiveness in Canada, but the question of independence, of sovereignty, yes, is a lower priority for voters now.
And Professor Ajadi, if you think longer term, even beyond this election, assuming that Donald Trump keeps up with his rhetoric around, annexing Canada or something along those lines, what does this do to sort of a potential, or what does it do to the sovereignty movement in Quebec, those who are still pushing for an independent Quebec?
Well, I think that one of the most notable things about kind of Trump's interventions is the ways that, if you're a Quebec sovereigntist, you might ask yourself, who is going to be better to work with? The whatever government in Canada or the United States, right? Who is going to respect Quebec's sovereignty more? And I think that when you're faced with that kind of choice, when the Americans get involved, very quickly you might say, well, we kind of need to park our vote with the people that will ultimately fight back against American intervention there. And so I think long term, if this keeps up, that's where I think a lot of people's thinking will be. America seems like the quote unquote big bad in relation to the French language and also to Canada's distinctiveness overall, compared to, some of the quibbling between Quebec as a province and Ottawa. I would also say, just to kind of build on what Jennifer was saying, that as a principle, I think that Mark Carney, despite not necessarily being that well versed in Quebec culture or in French, comes across as more as earnest and somewhat willing to be flexible. And so I think that it's also his tone. He's not necessarily adopting strong positions in a lot of ways, and he's kind of come out from the start to say, listen, we will protect the French language, we will protect Quebec culture, we will protect supply management. And so I think he's done a good job of at least allowing people to maybe hold their nose, so to speak, if they take a sovereigntist position, to say, well, at least this party is viable. And the Conservatives clearly also have at least a strong base in Quebec compared to previous elections, at least.
But I do think as well, for this discussion, we need to remember the strong bench that the Liberals have in
Yes.
this province.
Mhm.
So it is Mark Carney, but it's also, they're hugely advantaged by their Quebec cabinet ministers.
Yeah.
So Mélanie Joly, François-Philippe Champagne, Dominic LeBlanc, they're francophone cabinet ministers hold, and there's one other in Mark Carney's cabinet right now who comes from the island of Montreal. So there's a sense in which when Quebecers go to the polls, there's some very, very senior Liberals who are from this province, who have reputations of, standing up for the French language, for French culture, for Quebec's interest being at the cabinet table. And I think that also will matter with some voters.
That's actually a great answer, and also a great segue into the first question we received from our alumni audience. So again, if you're watching live, we only have a few minutes left, but if you want to send a question to us, you can do so at aoc@mcgill.ca. We did receive a question from Mike McGlynn, MBA 87. Thank you for your question, Mike. So his question, let me sort of parse through this. So he's suggesting that in this campaign, none of the leading parties are highlighting their teams, but are concentrating on their leaders only. And he would have thought that the Conservatives in particular would have recruited more star candidates to help them fill out their bench. We do not vote for a prime minister directly, he says. Should the local candidates not matter more than they appear? And is this a troubling trend? So, Professor Welsh, I don't know if you want to tackle that one first.
I think this is a great question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. So, when you think about the first Jean Chrétien government, I'm old, right? I'm ancient, so some of you may not remember that. But when I think about that government, you were electing a team. You were electing a very experienced prime minister who had been in cabinet, but you remember the members of that government. And I would say even in 2015, yes, it was Justin Trudeau's star power, for certain, but there was also a team sense. And I am actually quite troubled by the degree to which we are moving in almost a presidential way, to this election being focused so much on the leaders, and it really is. There hasn't been enough discussion in the country at large about the full slate of candidates. And I have found that surprising vis-a-vis Pierre Poilievre too, because of what Tari said a moment ago about his own brand being controversial, given his style in Parliament. You would have thought that he would have highlighted more, yes, vote Conservative, vote for us, vote for a team of people who want to come and create change in Ottawa. I think it's partly a function of this sense that we need someone to lead us in crisis that's focused us so much around individuals. But I personally don't like this shift because I think it's also not well suited to our parliamentary system, where it is cabinet government, it's the prime minister, it's not a presidential system. And yet this election looks a lot more like one than I would like.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll turn this next question over to you, Professor Ajadi. So a question came into us from Tony asking about the impact, the impact on the campaign of, well, he's saying traditional journalists versus largely he's saying US-based influencers. But I am curious. I think this gets at a very interesting question. I mean, this is sort of, I guess, the first or maybe second election in Canada in what we call the TikTok generation. I mean, how has the maybe diminishing role of traditional media versus the emerging role of social media and influencers had an impact on voters and voter mindsets?
I think that's an excellent question. It's something that, I'm very troubled by. And certainly, I think it also builds off the last question a little bit. I think this orientation towards this kind of presidential mindset, and a lack of kind of serious focus and attention to a team and the credentials of a team that would lead Canada is partially because of the kind of pivoting towards a really distorted and unfocused media landscape, right? We saw this principally in the Debates Commission, or with the debates, right? We saw that the Debates Commission gave a plurality of the questions on the French language debate to particular kind of far right media influencers that by ruling in I believe it's not a Supreme Court ruling, but it was a Superior Court ruling, maybe in Ontario, are not journalists, right? They're media personalities, but they are not journalists. And it completely distorted the scrums after the French language debate. And subsequently, the very next night, they started such a significant fight that those post-debate scrums were cancelled, right? This is not a promising development. I think it's awful for our democracy. I think you combine that with the ban on sharing news sources by Meta online, and that creates just this vacuum of misinformation that's circulating. And I think that primarily, you've seen the Conservative Party through the kind of Pages Canada Proud and some of these other social media influencers really kind of catalyze a particular form of support. And, that's their business, that's their electoral strategy. But I think it's horrendous for democracy. I think that we need to be asking credible questions in a credible way. I think that all of the leaders should be sitting down with real journalists and getting grilled, and those things should be public facing, right? We're not getting that kind of robust discussion and debate. We're not getting a meaningful team approach. And I think that it's going to have significant consequences as things go on, as time continues to go on, and as misinformation becomes prevalent in everyday life. I think it will filter us into these bubbles where we can't even have meaningful discussions about what the problems might be. And so I'm deeply troubled by this as well. And I think that there are a wealth of solutions that could be on the table, but it requires, I think, a completely different approach to media policy in Canada.
And
Interesting.
your previous question about local politicians is linked to this one. So if you think about the cuts in funding to local journalism, in particular, that makes it harder for all of us to know about our local MPs. That makes it more difficult to buck this trend towards kind of more centralized leadership. So I think that's absolutely true. And the point about the leaders not necessarily sitting down to do long form interviews or others, I think we're really missing that. We had 2 debates. They were actually very well run. The actual debate time, we put aside what happened with
Right.
news. They were actually, my daughter's a first-time voter, and she watched the debate, and I was proud of those debates. When we got to the end, I thought, this was well moderated, but we only had 2 of them. And there wasn't a lot of opportunity to see that kind of engagement or answers from the different party leaders.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm going to try to sneak in one more question that we've just got in, maybe before we wrap things up. This one just came in from Karen. I don't know if you want to take it, Professor Welsh, to start. Interested to hear, what do you think may happen to the Conservative Party and specifically to Pierre Poilievre if they lose this election?
It depends a lot on by how much.
Mm.
My guess is that if there's a Liberal majority, he may not be able to stay on as leader. There may be a reckoning in the Conservative Party that they need to tack more to what voters perceive to be the center, and that he may not survive. And we may have a Conservative leader who's not a member of Parliament, who emerges from a regeneration of the Conservative Party. If it's a minority, I think it's less certain. But we have to step back and say 6 months ago, this was an election that Pierre Poilievre should have won, whether with a majority or a minority.
Well, let me ask you this follow-up. Thinking back now with, of course, hindsight, given the fact that it's not Justin Trudeau, it's Mark Carney, given the fact that the topic is Donald Trump and the trade wars, do you think the Conservatives would have been served better in this election had they gone with a more traditional, say, Jean Charest as leader versus Pierre Poilievre?
My own personal view is that would have been a better choice for this moment. But let's not forget how much Pierre Poilievre has mobilized Conservative supporters across the country. His rallies one of those more traditional conservatives may not have been able to generate the kind of enthusiasm. The organizational power of Pierre Poilievre's party has been really significant. But I think on balance, I agree with you. We might have been having a different election at that leader level, but there is that other side that I think we need to recognize.
Right. And they were electing a leader, as you mentioned, at a different moment in time as well. Let me just, one more question for you, Professor Ajadi. We talked earlier, well, obviously we're talking a lot about conservative versus liberal. What about this notion of a majority government emerging versus a minority government? Do you think a majority government gives that government, whoever it may be, a stronger hand in its dealings with Washington? Or does a minority government maybe create more interesting scenarios?
I think voters will likely be seeking a majority government. I think that the rhetoric throughout the campaign has been we need a strong government, whatever side that government falls. And so I don't anticipate that a minority government will be in the cards or last very long. But I want to come back to the previous question partially because I actually disagree. I think that the Conservative Party is the Liberals have kind of gone through their existential crisis, and somehow Mark Carney fell into their laps and has solved a lot of the kind of internal caucus divisions that they had, at least temporarily. I think the Conservatives are in for a massive fight. I think especially if they lose in a majority, but even in a minority government situation. I think that this massive shift in the polls is unprecedented. I think that you're already seeing infighting within the party come out. Of course, the party was a fusion between two very distinct wings once upon a time, and those camps never really went away. They were papered over by winning. When we see Erin O'Toole previously being the leader, that was the progressive conservative wing of the party coming to the fore, and very quickly the reform side decided to nix that. And now we're seeing, I think, perhaps the converse. I'm not sure that the party is going to be able to survive in quite the same form because I think that these camps aren't able to resolve effectively. But the base of the party is very much in the more populist kind of orientation. So this is going to be, I think, a year of a lot of internal wrangling and internal party politics coming to the fore. If it's happening during the election, one can only imagine what happens after an electoral defeat.
Just a quick last word, and I promise I'll be quick, Derek, on the majority. If you're looking at this from the perspective of Donald Trump, I think Canada would be better served vis-a-vis Donald Trump with the majority government, because let's remember the attitude that Donald Trump takes towards other leaders. He's looking at the size of their support. He is the president that has been saying to Volodymyr Zelensky, you haven't had an election in a while.
Right.
You need to have an election, right? So there's a sense in which he respects people who come to him who have a lot of domestic support behind them. That's what he thinks gives people credibility, which is why he has given Keir Starmer a lot of time, because he knows Keir Starmer has a majority. Wow. So I think that's an interesting thing for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And regardless who wins this election on Monday, Donald Trump will be here for the next 4 years to deal with. So I know we're just about at a time. Maybe if I give each of you 20 seconds for a final response to a question, which is, I mean, if you want to give a prediction of what's going to happen on Monday, I would invite you to. If not, what should we be looking for in these last few days of the campaigns that might indicate where things are going? Professor Welsh, you want to, in 20 seconds, give us a quick answer?
I think we should really look at turnout, because I think high turnout shows Canadians' level of engagement, whether they really think it's a consequential election. I think high turnout favors the Liberals.
Okay, Professor Ajadi?
Yeah, I'll stick my neck out there. I think it's going to be a Liberal majority. I think that the advanced polling numbers might indicate this. I think that the Liberal vote efficiency might indicate this. I think that the massive polling gap in the GTA and in Ontario might indicate this. I think it's going to be a Liberal majority.
So can I say that at 1 p.m. the McGill News webcast has declared a Liberal majority?
Maybe we'll wait. Please don't.
Maybe we'll wait. Anyway, we are at 1 o'clock.
Let's see.
We'll see.
It's going to be interesting to watch.
And we may want to have you back afterwards to do a post-election recap. That could be interesting as well. But we are at 1 o'clock, so that does wrap up the time we have today. Before we bring the webcast to a close, I'd like to remind you that this video will be available at this very same link after our recording ends. So feel free to share with others who may not have been able to tune in live, ideally within the next 4.5 days. I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our two guests, Professor Jennifer Welsh and Tari Ajadi from McGill's Department of Political Science and the Maxwell School of Public Policy, for joining me today and providing such incredible insight ahead of next week's election. It certainly left us with a lot to think about as we head into Election Day and the uncertain future to follow. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and please continue to stay tuned to your McGill email and social media feeds over the coming weeks, where we'll continue to share news about our exciting online and in-person programming. Until then, please be well, and if you are tuning in from Canada, please vote. Thank you very much.